Well, good afternoon, and I think that we can start with our roundtable. And well, Valentine Lomellini told me that I had to chair this session, you know, and I told her yesterday that my role is more or less like the role of Stakhanov, you know, because that's the second round, you know. It's I was involved yesterday, today, and also tomorrow, you know. Okay, never mind, you know. But I think I am going to receive some sort of, you know, star, you know, for work done. Well, I would say that it's for me it's a real pleasure to be here, you know. So to take part to this round table and to discuss about the last volume published by Valentine, which is the Lodo Moro, you know, the Moro compromise, the Moro agreement, as you prefer, Terrorismo e ragion di Stato, 1969-1986. Why it's a pleasure? Well, not only because I had the opportunity to read the book, and of course I am going to do some comments about this volume, but because I think that I met for the first time Valentine some years ago, a few years ago, when she was young. She's still young, obviously. That's not my case. What you're saying. And she was a young university student, you know, and I just moved from the University of Florence, where I spent several years, to the University of Padua. So it was my first course, you know, at the University of Padua. It was a very small course. I think I had just 6 students, if I am correct. Later on, things changed very much, you know, and I had definitely more students. And obviously, I appreciate, you know, the interest by Valentine towards, well, international history and in general. And later on, Valentine asked me to work out her dissertation, MA, you know, and under my supervision. And it was a very interesting experience because she started working on a topic that in that period was not well known, you know, and, which was the attitude by the Italian left towards the dissidents, you know, in East Central Europe and also in the Soviet Union, and then after, you know, the main discussion of the dissertation, Valentine was a bit uncertain, you know, what to do after, you know, the MA, and she told me that she preferred to become a journalist, you know. I have some doubts about that, you know, that why you want to become a journalist, you know. Well, never mind, you know. I think that perhaps you can go on, you know, in the academia. Of course, it's not easy, and it's a bit difficult, you know, to go on, but, you know, why not? And luckily, she applied for the School of Journalism and she failed. Yeah. So, kind of and so as a consequence of this failure, is that why not, you know, to do a PhD, you know? Well, I am joking a bit, obviously, you know, but, you know, she did a PhD, which was on the topic, you know, it was a development, obviously, you know, the topic of the, you know, attitude by the Italian left, especially the Italian Communist Party, you know, but not only the Communist, also the Socialist Party, towards the issue of the dissidents in the 1970s, 1980s, and it was under the supervision of somebody who was a very good historian. Luckily, she died a bit earlier, too earlier, which was Victor Zaslavsky, you know. And of course, Victor had, I would say, a direct experience of being a dissident, you know, in the Soviet Union, because he was compelled to leave in the 1970s, and he went to Canada and later on to the Lewis University in Rome, and you know, after the PhD, Valentine published, you know, her first volume, which in my opinion is still an important volume. It's a point of reference about the controversial, bit difficult attitude, especially by the communists, the Italian communists, towards the dissident movements in East Central Europe. And I had the opportunity to discuss on many occasions with Valentine about her research, her project, then she moved to other topics, not only, the communist, for some time say, no, it's too much, too much, too much with the communists. But and then, she decided to deal with a very difficult topic, which is the one of terrorism, but I don't want, to say anything else about, the volume, because I'm going to do my comments, to the comments later. And so I will give the floor, to the first speaker, and to Professor Cooke, Philip Cooke, who is a professor at the University of Strathclyde in the United Kingdom. He is a specialist, of the history of Italian society, of Italian history in general. And so I leave him the floor for his comments about, this volume on the attitude by the Italian state, I would say by Italian state, the Italian authorities, towards the phenomenon of international terrorism, starting with the 1960s till the mid-1980s. So, Professor Cooke, please.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you above all to Valentine Lomellini for giving me the opportunity to be here at the spring school. I've managed to speak just briefly with a few of the participants, and already discovered that you come from all over the world, even as places distant as Milan and Belluno, but also one from young lady from Slovakia and from Iran as well. So it seems, certainly from my first impressions, and I'm sure this will continue to be the case, that we're here in a very interesting and stimulating collective enterprise from which all of you will derive a great benefit, but which we, the people that are involved at the other end as well, will find a great deal of interest. So, I mean, I do hope that we have the opportunity for discussion and the exchange of ideas, and that in particular this book presentation this evening is not just a one-way process of the powerful professors talking and the audience listening in silence. My experience of Italy is usually quite the opposite, and that there is customary a great deal of discussion. I should say as well, I've become somewhat of a veteran of book presentations recently. The last one that I gave was involved in was just a couple of weeks ago on the 30th of April, a former colleague indeed of Professor Lomellini's Santopeli, whose book on the resistance we presented in Parma, but in a completely different location than we are at the moment. Here we are in one of the most august rooms and one of the most august universities in Italy, surrounded by the university archives. We could find out all sorts of interesting things about the 19th century students that frequented the University of Padua. But where I was in Parma was in the open air, in a square. I'd never given a book presentation in a square before. It was an extremely odd experience, I have to say. The audience came in, sat down, and started to drink beer immediately. And whereas obviously here we're in a slightly different situation. But I hope, of course, that the kind of formality of the surroundings don't detract from the potential discussion that we can have. So with that preface, let me turn to the book in Lodo Moro. First of all, I should say that expression Lodo is quite difficult to translate into English because it's a juridical term and deals with or describes a kind of process of negotiation usually between jurists, between judges, in order to reach a kind of final decision. And so, whereas in English, it's very difficult to find a translation for it. And in fact, it's probably one of the questions that I would ask Valentine, that if, as we hope, there's an English translation of this book, what title are you going to give to it? So the word Lodo, as I said, describes a process of negotiation. And in this case, a process of negotiation that's been specifically applied to the Italian statesman, the Christian Democrat politician, Aldo Moro, who, as we know, was the victim of one of the most shocking and notorious terrorist attacks of the 1970s, not just in Italy, but in the world, kidnapped by the Red Brigades in Rome and executed after 55 days of imprisonment. And after his death, the rumors, began to circulate that it was Moro himself who was responsible for the creation of a kind of agreement, a tacit agreement, an under-the-table agreement, an informal agreement, which defined the nature of the relations between the Italian state and the Arab world, but specifically Palestine, Libya, other countries as well. An agreement that, in a sense, allowed Italy to escape any terrorist attacks for a long period during the 1970s, and we'll come to that, the chronology and the events in the 70s in a second or two. Now, the Lodo Moro, as it's known, has been the subject of an awful lot of speculation and a large number of scientifically dubious publications. This is the case not just for the Lodo Moro, but the case, regrettably, for many studies or would-be studies of Italian terrorism in the 1970s, many of which are full of speculation and supposition, and not necessarily based on the kind of rigorous scientific research which we see in Valentine's work. So what this book does is to distance itself from a great deal of the rather poor quality work that's been published. I hate to use the word journalistic, because I have very many friends who are journalists, and there are possibly even journalists here in the audience this evening, and one wouldn't wish to suggest that journalists are inferior beings in any way, but nevertheless, the topic of Italian terrorism in the 1970s has attracted a great deal of, can I use a slightly complicated word in English, specious publications, and I'm pleased to say, as I knew all along, because I've known Valentine for some time, that this is not a specious publication by any means. It's a work of extreme rigor, a work which is based on a really remarkable amount of archival sleuthing. If you have a look at the book, you'll see in at the end the list of archives that Valentine has been into, and she has, to use an English expression, walked the walk to do her research. She's not stayed in her office in Scienze Politiche at the University of Padua and tried to find things on the internet. She's got her rucksack out and traveled widely, presumably before COVID, and has visited a large number of archives, not just in Italy, of course, but because this is an international book. She's visited archives in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, and in many other countries as well. And walking the walk, it seems to me, is one of the messages that you should take away with you after this summer school, that if you're serious researchers, this is what you have to do. You can't just sit in your offices hoping that you'll be able to find the information that you're looking for. You've got to get out there. You've got to get into the archives and poke around, ask awkward questions, as I'm sure you will have done, and try your best to get the information together. I mean, it's clear that on some occasions, Valentine, you've struggled to persuade people to let you see some stuff. I mean, it's a very interesting section when you're dealing with the pardon or the act of grazia that now it was, I can't remember which president it was now, you'll have to remind me, but I think it's 3 individuals that are pardoned, and trying to find the motivation for this and trying to establish exactly what went on is difficult because you couldn't see the documents concerned. But what you managed to do on the basis of an extraordinary piece of detective work, it seems to me, putting all the pieces of the mosaic together, you worked out, okay, this act of pardon must actually have pertained to these 3 individuals. So a brilliant piece of archival research, and for which Valentine deserves huge praise. Now, let's get back to these events of the 1970s, starting with the attack in Munich at the Olympics in 1972. This is really the beginning of this phase of violence. And I was 7-year-old boy at the time. I can still even vaguely remember this event and how shocking it was. And so this really, I suppose, is the starting point, 1972. And we have another potentially linked event in Ostia, just near Rome, near the airport in the autumn, I think it is, of 1972. A failed attempt, so it seems, to shoot down an airplane with Golda Meir on board, and this failed event, as I said, dates to 1972. We then get what Valentine describes as a bad year, 1973, with a number of terrorist attacks of Middle Eastern origin, shall we say, taking place in that year. And culminating in the case of Italy in the attack at Fiumicino Airport in December, it is, of 1973, which led 34 dead, a hijack plane traveling to various different destinations, negotiations with the perpetrators of the attack, a huge impact on international relations as well. And then, as the book clearly demonstrates, post the Fiumicino attack, so say December 1973, there's then a huge hiatus, a pause, a gap, and the next terrorist attack of Middle Eastern origin, shall we say, is nearly 10 years later. The Rome Synagogue in 1982, another attack at Fiumicino in 85, and then the hijacking of the Achille Lauro ship cruise ship in 1985. And these are all attacks. I keep using the word attack. It's attentato in Italian, all which have, should we say, slightly different modalities: hijacks, the use of missiles, bombs, rifles, the ship hijack, which is one of the first occasions that such an approach had been taken. And so what emerges clearly from these events is the big question: well, why is it that from 1973, from December 1973 until October of 1982, why is it that nothing seems to happen in Italy? And this is where the Lodo Moro comes in, and an agreement, a secret agreement, which seems to maintain Italy, to maintain Italy's. I speak so much in Italian these days, that I'm actually struggling to put some words together in English. This is one of the problems of being multilingual. Everything's coming into my head in Italian at the moment. So if it sounds a little bit strange, I do ask for your indulgence. So yes, this gap in which there would appear to be some kind of agreement known as the Lodo Moro. Now, what Valentine does very convincingly is to demonstrate that this type of agreement is not just the product of an internal Italian situation, that this agreement fits in with the extraordinarily complex system of international relations which attained in the 1970s. She manages, I think, in a very compelling and convincing way to demonstrate that the Lodo Moro, but we'll come back to Moro's role in a second or two, can only be understood on the basis of setting it within the much wider international context. And this for me, I think, is one of the most praiseworthy elements of the book. If I have a criticism of Italian colleagues, but it's one that applies to many others as well, is that there is a tendency to look very much at questions according to a national grill. What we're finding in amongst historians anyway is that the move towards transnational approaches has encouraged historians to look beyond national histories. And I think what the discipline of international relations has done as well is that it has forced scholars to move beyond their immediate comfort zone, and also to have to engage in archival research, sometimes in languages with which they're not familiar. And in fact, it would be interesting, Valentine, if you would just talk about the linguistic dimension of your work and the extent to which that presented you with any challenges. So as I was saying, what the book does is to look very, very carefully on the basis of meticulous archival research into the process by which the Lodo Moro was created and then developed. Now, Valentine individuates, I was about to say, that's an Italian word. Valentine manages to outline, that's the word I'm looking for, manages to outline, I think, two distinct phases, the first of which runs from 1969 to 1973, so up to Fiumicino, okay, and then from 74 to 1981. So she puts in a very precise chronology. I think also what we find as well, above all, is that you explode the idea of that it's the Lodo is specific to Moro and to Moro's operations and to Moro's diplomacy. It goes wider than that, and in fact, in many ways, it probably should be called the Lodo Andreotti, because most of the, if I could use the word, shenanigans takes place with the involvement of Andreotti, and we get some very interesting and compelling analysis of the machinations of this quintessential politician. the way that he worked, and how eventually the paradigm, if you like, created by the Lodo then starts to crumble in the mid-80s with the Fiumicino attack, and then the Achille Lauro attack as well. I think as well that one of the aspects that comes out from the book is the galaxy, the very complex galaxy of Middle Eastern terrorist attacks. And this is something which is very difficult to understand for somebody like myself that comes from a blinkered country such as the United Kingdom. And what I found is that your ability to be very precisely delineate the different factions within the galaxy of the PLO, but other organizations as well, helped very much to allow me to understand precisely what was going on here. Now, just one or two comments, and I'll wind up, because I suspect my time and my colleagues as well want to have the opportunity to say their thing as well. So for me, this is an extraordinarily successful book, which I enjoyed very much reading, and which I hope is translated into English. If it is translated into English, I hope that the University of Padua finds a decent translator, however. And I hate to be polemical here, but one of the things that I spend a great deal of time doing as a British academic who works with Italians is to check the translations of their work into English that have been done. And most of the time, this has led me to alcoholism and nervous despair. Because if I've understood correctly, the University of Padua uses translation agencies who know nothing about Italian history, and they know nothing about international relations. So if you do get the book translated, Valentine, please do contact me first of all, just so that we can make sure that you've got somebody good. So it does deserve to be translated, because it tells us so much about the 1970s. It tells us so much about, in many ways, kind of mysterious events of the 1970s. Events as well, which, Valentine, you say have been almost erased from Italian memory. And I think this is a very interesting point that you made. Why is it that certain events of the 1970s are remembered in the way that they are? And obviously, the kidnap of Moro, the Bologna bombing of 1980s, the stragismo of the time. Whereas, what you're saying, the 1973 attack, above all, on Fiumicino, has passed into the dimenticatoio of Italian memory. What perhaps I would have liked, if I'm allowed a minor cavilla, if that's possible, is I would have liked you to have said a little bit more about this topic and the reasons for this, the eclipse, if you like, of this event. One more chapter. It seemed to me dealing with, because you stop. And rightly so, you stop in the mid-80s. But it would be interesting, I think, to see how this memory, or this absence of memory, has evolved, because obviously absences of memory have to evolve for some reason as well. So as a historian of memory, these kind of things interest me, and so I would have liked perhaps a little more. Just a couple of observations. I've always been interested in the way Italians write. Okay. And sometimes write in a way which is not so easy to understand. And I'm pleased to say that, Valentine, that you've avoided the enormously sort of complex syntax, much beloved of, I must say now, older generations. Forgive me, Antonio, of Italian academics. But actually, I got the impression sometimes that you've almost gone too far the other way. There are times when I was saying, I wish you could just say a little bit more about this. So it struck me. I mean, the length of the book there's a lot of notes. aren't there? There's like 90 pages of notes, and it's almost as if you've taken a decision. I'm going to put this stuff in the main text, and I'll relegate a lot of the academic discussion into the notes. And I just wondered whether you could have balanced things out a little bit more there. But I can understand where you're coming from, and I can understand where your publisher's coming from as well. And one thing that you might want to do is, if you go to the Latezza website, there's a short video, and which is fantastically done. Is it just out here as well? So they filmed you just out here, and you explain it. You explain it in an extremely succinct fashion in Italian. You should do a video in English, however, if that's possible. So, as I say, just a few things about memory and about the way that you it's not a criticism of the writing style, but it's just it's an observation. It seems to me. I mean, you've uncovered all sorts of fascinating material. Some of the things that went on in Rome in the 1970s are really quite astonishing. It seems to me. So a book which I think is extremely important. It casts light, not just on some very important events that have been glossed over in Italian history from the 70s and early 80s, but I think in particular placing what happened in Italy in this international framework, makes people like yourselves should therefore be interested in reading this book, and not just from the perspective of Italian history, but also it's a methodologically interesting approach as well. So I hope I've given you a decent flavour of the book, and as I say, I wish it every success, and I do hope that there is an English, or indeed, there are versions in many different languages, because it does deserve to be read widely. And I'd like to thank you, Valentine, for the work that you've done.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cooke, for your very interesting comments, which do not deal only with the Valentine book, but in general, about the question of terrorism and how terrorism was felt and was perceived by the Italians. I think that you were right, because I think that the public opinion tends very quickly, to forget terrorism. I just remember, the opinion polled by the ISPI, the Institute for Study on International Politics in Milan, and there was an opinion poll in 2015, and one of the questions was, in your opinion, which is the most serious problem, in the international relations? And 2015, the first was terrorism. Obviously, everybody remember, the Bataclan, what happened, etc. And I think that just 2 or 3 years later, the same people, because, it was an opinion poll directed to, university professor and something like that, academics, journalists, diplomats, and so on. And I think the international terrorism was perhaps the fourth. And the first, if I am correct, was the economic crisis or something like that. So, terrorism, it's, put aside, probably because it's so unpleasant, phenomenon. And so everybody thinks, well, I want to forget it. I don't want to hear any longer about, the loss of life, of, innocent people, or so on, But at the same time, I think that it's important, to remember what happened, and I think that Valentine book, it's important also for this reason. But I think I'm going to do some comments later on. So now I will give the floor to Professor you know, Paolo Wulzer, and Paolo Wulzer is a full professor of history and international relations at the University of Naples, L'Orientale, which is a university, an important one, you know, specialized especially in the studies in, well, Asia, Africa, you know, and everything which is outside Europe and the United States usually, you know, but also with some interest towards Russia, for example. And well, Professor Wulzer has published extensively, you know, on topics such as Cold War, Italian foreign policy, and Italian role in the Mediterranean area, and so on. And of course, I leave him the floor, and so for his comments on Valentine's volume on Valentine's book. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Varsori. Thanks to Valentine for inviting me to this roundtable, and thanks to everyone who is attending this seminar. I would like to share with you my general considerations about the book of Valentine, and then to offer some perspectives about the possible linking of the themes of this volume to the, I would say, the European community policy towards the Mediterranean in the 70s, which is the period covered by the book of Valentine. The book of Valentine is very stimulating reading. I would say is a must-read book for anyone interested in Italian domestic and international history, as well as in the history of the international terrorism and the Mediterranean situation during the late Cold War. The volume provides an insightful and rich analysis of the origin and evolution, as well as of the narrative and perceptions about the so-called Lodo Moro. This formula was first formulated. Its first formulation was owed to the Italian President Cossiga, who labeled the secreted and unofficial agreement, which, starting from 1973, granted the Palestinian terrorism the freedom of movement in Italy, as well as the free flow of arms through the peninsula, in exchange with the Palestinian commitment not to target Italian objectives. The book which is grounded on massive multi-archival research, adopted the national international nexus perspective with the aim of shedding new light on a relevant page of our history, as well as on a complex stage of Italy's long-standing Mediterranean policy, not free from inner contradiction and shortcomings. In my opinion, the volume holds a twofold merit. The first one is to confirm the existence of the Lodo, of the informal pact. The second one is to try to dismantle myths, legends, which have traditionally prevented to tackling the history of the Lodo with historiographical methodology. Valentine adopts a broader perspective with respect to the previous works dealing with the same topic, and I think that she introduces a number of remarkable innovative aspects. Firstly, the notion that the so-called Lodo Moro, far from being a policy conceptualized and implemented only by the democratic Christian leader, was a strategic goal pursued by different Italian decision makers who held in those years the position of Prime Minister, of Minister of Foreign Affairs, or even the post of the President of the Italian Republic. Indeed, political figures like Rumor, Andreotti, Craxi, and Leone, with the active engagement of the Secret Service, of course, played the role of protagonists in the story unfolding throughout the pages of the book. Therefore, as Valentine argues, the formula Lodo Italia, rather than Lodo Moro, appears to be more suitable for defining both an internal and foreign policy choice, which involved multiple levels of Italian decision-maker system, with the ultimate aim to protecting homeland security and safeguarding national interest. The second innovative aspect of the book is the European, I would say, European comparative perspective that she adopts in the book. This This perspective allows the reader to critically raise the issue of the analogies and divergences of the Italian counter-terrorism strategy with respect to those developed in the other European countries. Valentine argued that similarities rather than differences prevailed, as France, Austria, among others, concluded deals that were not far from the rationale, from the logic of the Lodo Moro. In particular, Vienna endeavored in delivering the Palestinian terrorists to countries considered as supportive of the Palestinian movements, as they would have managed to keep the most extreme fringes under control. The third important aspect which emerged from the volume is the fact that the topic of the deal between the Italian political circles and the Palestinian terrorists is correctly assessed in the book as a landmark step of the Italian foreign and Mediterranean policy. The need to handle with the impact of the short-term and long-term impact of the economic and energetic crisis of the early 70s, coupled with the aim of fostering security and stability in the region, and with the long-standing ambition of Italy to assume the role of a sort of a bridge builder between the United States and the Mediterranean world, these factors embodied in the Italian pro-Arab stance and posture in that decade. Though it represented a strategic approach whose roots laid down in the history of the Italian Mediterranean policy following World War II, it gave birth to a number of relevant initiatives in the period covered by the book. Among them, I would mention the agreement reached with Gaddafi's Libya and Saddam Hussein Iraq, being two of the main sponsors and patrons of the Palestinian terrorism, became a sort of, I would say, litmus paper for the sustainability of the whole Lodo Moro approach. Now, I would like to try to place the book of Valentine in the context of the political debate about the Lodo Moro. My impression is that the political debate around the informal agreement about the deal has traditionally been focused on two crucial issues. On the one hand, the actual existence or not of the pact. On the other hand, the basis on which Italian and Palestinian authorities reached the agreement. The book of Valentine, as well as the work of 2018 by Giacomo Pacini, based on judicial sources, and also by the articles of Gabriele Paradisi and Giordana Terracina, assessing the references to the deal contained in the Aldo Moro's letter from the prison, paved the way to a breakthrough in this kind of debate. The existence of the pact, as well as its term consisting in the exchange between Palestinian in the needs of the security needs of Italy and the Palestinian freedom of movements throughout the peninsula, is no longer questioned. The issue currently at stake, on which the book of Valentine sheds new light, are the involvement of the Italian political spheres in implementing the deal, as well as in its framing in the Italian foreign and security policy in the Mediterranean. New evidences show that what was labeled Lodo Moro, far from being a personal initiative of Aldo Moro, or far from being just the domain of the activities limited to Italian Secret Service and Palestinian terrorists, was a security policy pursued by the Italian state as such. Moreover, the deal cannot but being assessed as a part of the overall Italian strategy in the southern neighborhood, aimed at building political stability and securing economic and energetic national interests in the area. As for the methodology of the book, I particularly appreciated the effort to Europeanization and internalization of the theme of the Lodo Moro. As Valentine correctly argues, far from being a sort of Italian anomaly, the security strategy and tactic envisaged in the pact was shared by a number of European countries during the decade of the 70s. The aim of safeguarding national territories from terrorism activities led a number of European governments to conclude not belligerent unofficial pacts with the so-called Palestinian resistance, as well as with states sponsoring and supporting terrorism. The so-called Lodo Moro embodied itself in a twofold anti-terrorism strategy pursued by the Italian state as well as by European countries. On the one hand, it was the organization of a newly established information and operational structures devoted to contrast the terrorism, which cannot but be considered a new phenomenon in the 70s, both for its qualitative and quantitative terms. On the other hand, the Lodo Moro was the opening, the Lodo Moro and the similar initiatives which took place in other European countries marked the opening of informal and unofficial channels of dialogue with the political arm of the terrorist movement, with the aim of influencing both their strategy and tactics. The adoption of a global methodological approach proves to be fitted to the assessment of the phenomenon of the terrorism and its short and long-term impact during the troubled decade of the 70s. This is due not only to the, of course, transnational nature of the terrorism, but to the profound interconnections existing between the international system, the international dynamics, and the development of the terrorism itself. The intersection between the terrorism and the evolution of the global system in that period, spanning from the East-West detent process to the so-called Second Cold War, as well as its connection with the global issues stemming from the North-South confrontation, with particular regard to the implication of the late decolonization and to the politicization of the energy issues, make the global lens, the global methodology adopted by the author, the inescapable approach for studying, for analyzing the inception and the evolution of the international terrorism of the 70s. Moreover, embracing a European perspective in dealing with the theme of the European government's approach in contrasting the Arab-Palestinian terrorism of the 70s, call into question the theme of the European community effort to speak with one voice vis-à-vis the Middle East issue during that decade. As scholarly debate extensively highlighted, in the period spanning from the outbreak of the October War of 1973 to the issuing of the so-called Venice Declaration of 1980, the European community endeavored to gain a regional actorness in the Mediterranean, being probably the most ambitious attempt in the history of European integration to develop a distinctive European feature in the Mediterranean. While in the previous stages of the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian issue, the European community was proved to be unable to even schedule the theme of the Middle East in the European agenda, mainly due to the diverging national policy towards the issues and to the lacking of a political dimension in the integration process. The multidimensional aspects of the October War, coupled with the shaping of the European political cooperation which took place in the early 70s, prompt the European community to abandon its own regional inactivity and to embrace a newly conceptualized regional posture. If we make a rapid survey of the European community official documents released during the 70s and devoted to the Middle Eastern issues, confirm to which extent the October War represented a watershed in the Middle East intervention of the European community. In 1971, the so-called Schuman Report, in the so-called Schuman Report, the European community for the first time expressed the take that the withdrawal of Israel from the territories occupied in the Six-Day War, thus embracing an extensive interpretation of 242 UN Security Council, withdraw from the territories and not from territories, could but be regarded as the preliminary condition for building peace between Arabs and Israelis. The document was leaked to the press and fueled an harsh reaction of Israel. Why should the Europeans deal with our boundaries? This was the answer steamed in the question steamed in Israel, which led the European community to downsize the document to a simple internal note, not reflecting at all the European official stance on the issue. The picture drastically changed in the aftermath of the October War. The European Community Declaration of the Middle East, issued in the late 73, introduced for the first time the notion of satisfying the legitimate Palestinian rights in order to establish a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. Unlike what happened 2 years earlier, this occasion, the harsh reaction of Israel, which labeled the spirit of the document as all for Europe rather than peace for the Middle East, did not prove any rethinking in the European community approach. Rather, it was the transatlantic divide, as it's well known, which unfolded in the mid-70s, which provoked the reassessment of the European regional approach. The rift between the United States and Europe over the Middle East and oil issues, as well as on the European community regional ambition, prompted the European community, Europe, to revisit some aspects of its own regional policy. To not abdicating to the pro-Arab and pro-Palestinian stance, the following stage of the European projection in the Middle East was marked by a higher degree of European community caution in making the Mediterranean dimension of the European political cooperation and the transatlantic relation not to conflict. While the Euro-Arab dialogue was shaped according to US perspective, eliminating the Arab-Israeli question and the oil issue from the agenda of cooperation, the subsequent European documents on the Middle East adopted in the framework of the European political cooperation did mirror the recomposed transatlantic bargain on regional issues. Indeed, both the London Declaration of 77 and the Venice Declaration of 80, though advancing principles in continuity with those expressed in the earlier stage, or even more innovative, for example, the notion of Palestinian homeland, containing in the London Declaration, and the recognize of the PLO as the legitimate interlocutor in the regional dialogue, which was included in the Venice Declaration. They represented the outcome of a preliminary negotiation with the United States. Therefore, in the late 70s, all the cards of the Middle Eastern game was held in the hands of the United States, as witnessed by the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which neglected the Palestinian issue. However, the European community struggled in affirming its regional presence as a normative power, embracing perspective which would become prevalent in the international community discourse over the Middle East in the late 80s and early 90s. I think that the book of Valentine added important element also to this story. Okay, I finished. Thank you.
I think that it's now to me to say something about this book, and I would like to be brief because time is short, and I would prefer to leave Valentine some time, perhaps to add some comments to our comments and so on, which are, in my opinion, the most important aspects of the most important features of this book. Well, very much has been already said by my two previous colleagues, and well, first of all, it's a scholarly book, which is important, and it's a book which is based on extensive multi-archival research in several different countries, and also on the, I would say, on the skill by Valentine to make the right use of these documents, you know. To make use of documents, it's not always so easy, you know, because sometimes we focus obviously on the most exciting, you know, aspect of the documents, and so sometimes we forget, you know, the rest of the document. This is not the case. I think that Valentine was able, you know, to examine this record and at length and try to find out which, in my opinion, is more important, and which are the main result, you know, of this book. Well, first of all, I think that my first impression is that is connected with the question of Lodo Moro. You know, why the Lodo Moro? You know, why the Italian public opinion was so much interested in the Lodo Moro, in spite of what we said before, you know, that we forget terrorism. Well, because we thought, well, there is something secret, you know, something which we do not know about what our politicians did, you know, and so something which it's impossible to confess, you know, something which was bad. And I think that this impression is tied also to the belief that Italy is a sort of special case, you know. Also, as far as terrorism is concerned, you know, there is always some secret, secret services doing bad things, etc. Only the Italian secret services, you know. Well, I mean, if we give a look to, if we examine this book, we discover that terrorism is a general phenomenon, you know, and it's not a Italian case, you know, or a sort of exception. The obvious, you know, debate about the exceptionalism of Italy, of Italy's history, you know, Italy's policy. Well, this is not the case. If we think about what happened, you know, in Western Europe, starting with the late 1960s, I think most of the European nations were, well, influenced, characterized by both domestic and international. Obviously, we must draw a line between domestic and international, but sometimes there are connections between the domestic phenomenon of the terrorism and international terrorism. You know, I can remember, you know, what about Spain? You know, and the ETA. Well, perhaps we forget that Admiral Carrero Blanco was killed by ETA, you know, and Admiral Carrero Blanco was not, you know, the last chap in the street, you know. He was the leader and was a man very near to Francisco Franco, you know, was the head of state, you know. So think about what happened in Britain with the IRA, you know, and they tried to kill Margaret Thatcher, you know, and almost they succeed, you know. Well, I mean, you know, it was in the hotel, you know, it's, she was lucky, I think, but anyway, think about the IRA. It was not limited, you know, to Northern Ireland, you know, it happened in Britain. And so think about France. International terrorists and domestic terrorists, you know, action direct. If you think about Germany, the Rote Armee Fraktion. So Italy was not just a special case. You know. Western Europe had also the United States, but in a different way, you know. The West had to deal with the phenomenon of terrorism, both domestic and international. And I think that if we examine Valentine's book, we have I would say, the evidence that it was not only a question of Italy. Also, we discover through this book that there was some general reaction by some Western European states towards the phenomenon of international terrorism. How we deal, you know, with international terrorism. And we discovered that their reaction, well, they were sometimes different, but on some occasion they were similar, you know. So once again, Italy was not a special case, you know. So when we think about the Lodo Moro, I think that we have to take into consideration this wide perspective, you know, there's an international perspective, just not to focus on the Italian case that usually happens, you know, especially in some books which are more polemical, you know, or something like that. That's the first remark. The second remark is once again the fact that Valentine was able to put, you know, the the case of Palestinian, Middle Eastern terrorism in the wider context as far as Italian foreign policy was concerned. When we think about, Italian foreign policy, we usually point out, well, the Atlantic choice, the Western choice, the European choice, and so on and so on, And sometimes, obviously, also we focus, for example, Paolo Wulzer, in some of his works, focus on the question of Mediterranean, of the Mediterranean side of Italy's foreign policy. But I would point out that, in my opinion, this was the most difficult case, for Italy. How to deal with a very complex situation with different actors, the Palestinian resistance, the different Arab states, and so on, with the interconnected and sometimes contrasting interests and contrasted policies. And at the same time, we must not forget that Italy is a Mediterranean country, It's just in the Mediterranean. And so we must deal with these aspects, and we are involved. We were involved from, starting with the 1950s, 50s onwards, And one of the Italian politicians' problems was how to deal with a crisis which started in the 1940s, and which is still here. So Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli, as you prefer, don't mind, I don't think. Well, there is some difference, but, the problem is still there, as we see now. And of course, if you have a source of conflict, a real conflict, which is not so far from your shores, I think you must deal with that. And of course, in my opinion, Valentine books also demonstrate that there were differences in the attitude of the Italian politician if we take into consideration the 1970s and the 1980s. Because the 1980s was a decade in which Italy's international position was very weak. Italy was more an object rather than a subject of foreign policy. The 1980s was a bit different, Italy had a more assertive foreign policy. And I think that also the question of terrorism must be seen in this wider context. If you think, for example, the 1980s, well, the 1970s, there was also the decision by the Italian politician, well, we must demonstrate to the Arab world that our position is different, for the rest of the West, especially as far as Israel is concerned and the Palestinian problem is concerned. But it was a passive, attitude, so sort of a reaction to decision taken by other actors. While in the 1980s, Italy tried to play a more assertive and I would say influential role. If you think, for example, 1982, 1984, and the participation to the multinational peace force in Lebanon, there was an important turning point in Italian foreign policy. And of course, also if we think about the Italian reaction to the Sigonella affair, it was completely different. Think about the same episode in the 1970s. It would be very difficult in the 1970s to say no to the United States, which on the contrary was possible in the mid-1980s. And Craxi and Andreotti, they said, okay, no, in the Sigonella affairs, there is an Italian responsibility. It's not, for the United States to take these people and to, and to transfer them to America, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we have to take into consideration on that, and I think that you can find everything, in Valentine books. So what I appreciate very much was this sort of wider perspective, the terrorism as a sort of international phenomenon which influenced not only Italy, but other Western European countries. And also the fact that the attitude by the Italian towards the phenomenon of international terrorism must be seen in the context of Italy's foreign policy in a general term. And last remark, I don't know whether we had a discussion with Valentine about that, I will think that perhaps I will change a bit the conclusion, but that it's a difference of opinion, I mean, in 1985, 1986, in my opinion, the Lodo Moro was no longer valid. I think there was a change in the attitude, not of Andreotti, I think, but definitely by Craxi. From what I saw, especially after the case of Fiumicino, the second attack, Craxi changed completely his attitude, towards terror. For example, I see some conversation Craxi had with François Mitterrand in 1986 and 1987. He was very much worried. He said, well, now Italy has to change its policy. We must cooperate with other Western European nations in order to counter international terrorism. He was very much worried, and he was convinced that the source of terrorism, were some, Palestinian groups, but behind the Palestinian groups, there was Syria, and it was Assad. He was convinced of that. I don't know whether he was right or not, but he was really convinced. And he told me to run. We have to do something. We have to cooperate. We have to work together, and we have to fight, against international terror. So I think he was doubtful about the question of compromise or something like that. I think there was a change in the attitude. I don't know Andreotti, but sure, Craxi changed his position, definitely. And what mattered, in my opinion, was that Craxi in 1986, 1987 was convinced that the problem of, Middle East crisis was not only the Palestinian or Israeli-Palestinian question, but he was very much worried. He told, for example, to other Western European leaders, and also he publicly stated that later on, I am very much worried about the rise of fundamentalism, especially in Northern Africa. He was very much worried about that. He was worried about Tunisia, he was worried about Morocco, he was worried about Egypt. He thought fundamentalism is rising. So it's not only the question of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, it's something which was more complex, more dangerous, and more widespread. So I think that the last year overall in your volume, in my opinion, was a period in which there was a change, in the attitude of the Italian, not of every Italian politician, but to some of our politicians, there was a change, and so it was, in my opinion, a turning point. But that's just the last remark, and so we have a few minutes for your comments, and also for some questions from the public, for the audience, obviously. So I leave the floor first of all to the audience, and later on, to Valentine, if she wants to add some comments. Yeah, but I think that you must come. There is the button.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for these very interesting comments on what promises to be a fascinating book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
You must buy it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Practical suggestion.
Just a couple of words. I mean, as you, Valentine, might imagine, given my work on Libya, maybe a few comments and a few insights on Libya's connections with international terrorism at the time and the role of Italy in that regard. Thank you.
Is there any further question? Well, if not, I will leave the floor to Valentine, so you have some minutes in order to reply.
I have a few minutes, I guess, because I think that the audience is very tired and we all deserve some fresh air and maybe a glass of wine. So I'm going to answer to the comments very quickly. First of all, I must say that I'm quite touched for your positive comments. I'm very happy. I worked very hard on this book, so I'm very appreciated your positive comments and also your questions. Very, very briefly about the structure of the book. Actually, Phil is right. So I tried to keep a very simple fil rouge. Try to use a very simple syntax, very short sentences. So just try to make this book really understandable from a wider audience. This is a very sensitive topic for Italian audience. Yeah, exactly. A very good suggestion. And so on one side, I try to keep, the text very simple. On the other side, I add a lot of footnotes because this helped me in order to maintain the text simple. But this also proved the scientific effort that I made, because if you deal with some, very sensitive topic, you have to deal very carefully in a very respectful way. So that's what I try to do. What I tried to do was trying to extract the Lodo Moro expression from the conspiring narration of the possible agreement that originated first time was mentioned in 1980, and then it was again mentioned, especially in the second half of the 2000, the first decade of the 2000s. So thanks to President Cossiga declaration dealing with the possible Lodo agreement with the Palestinian terrorists. The Lodo Moro has been narrated as a story of secret services, a thought by Aldo Moro himself alone, before he became a victim himself of terrorism of the Red Brigades. So I think that the most important probably contribution I'm trying to give, was to prove that was a story of policies, not secret services. It was a story of policies, it was a story of foreign policy, of security policy, and it was a story of politicians, because as you rightly pointed out, in this story is not involved Aldo Moro alone, but the most part of the ruling class of the Italian Republic, starting from different, representatives of the Christian Democrats until the socialists. So that's what I've tried to do. And also I'm very happy that you appreciated the methodology. So what I tried to do was to start from a different point of view. So dealing with terrorism in Italy, as mentioned till now, I guess, dealing with a domestic issue. And usually historians, historians that publish very keen books about terrorism did it mainly using Italian sources, Italian archive sources. So what I try to do is to start from what was my own background. So as historian of international relations, to understand terrorism as an international phenomenon, to understand terrorism as an actor of international relations, a non-state actor, and also a state actor, because actually the story, of international Arab-Palestinian terrorism of that period is a story of rogue countries that supported mercenaries during a couple of decades in order to use terrorism as tool of coercive diplomacy to a certain extent. And even more, if I may add something about that, I guess that this is a very particular point of view. It offers a very unique perspective, because terrorism was, at that time, a transnational actor acting in a bipolar order. So from a certain point of view, it anticipated some features of the new international order. It allows us a very new and fresh point of view on the international scenario. And what I said, so even more, it was a rational tool in international relations. So it was something that was used by state to develop a kind of different diplomacy. The second point, so I'm trying to, answer briefly to all the comments that you made, is that the comparative perspective allowed us to understand that the Lodo Moro was not a Lodo Moro, it was an Italian Lodo, an Italian agreement, but it was even more not a single policy of a single European country, was a shared policy, a shared European policy to a certain extent, at least with some of the main European countries. And it was, once again, a part of the Italian foreign policy. So that's why, when people are asking, is still, working this Lodo, I think that the answer is that if you conceive this agreement as part of the foreign policy, probably still working. We don't have documents about that, but the different perception of the agreement makes possible, to answer that possibly it is still working. But what was the Lodo then? So that's your question. The Lodo was a kind of agreement, obviously, but it was a kind of dynamic process. It was a dynamic negotiation that developed according three elements, at least. So the evolution of the terroristic threat on one side. Second point, the continuing redefinition of different interlocutors. So first, the Arab-Palestinian Arab-Palestinian organizations and activists, and then Libya that was involved since the very beginning, and then Iraq, and then Syria. And third element, the development of the international context. So these three features, these three elements, allow us to understand that the Lodo, the agreement, was a kind of triangle-shaped dynamics that was very complex and was developing over years. So we don't have one single document that says the Lodo model exists. We have several documents that show a kind of trajectory towards the definition of a foreign policy. What about the Libya connection? As I mentioned, so we have, I guess, that's one of the part on which I work very hard, try to understand how after the mass murder in Fiumicino 1973, there was a change of interlocutors. So the interlocutor for the Italian foreign minister, for the Italian interior ministry was not any longer the Palestinian resistance, but it was another interlocutor, a state interlocutor, which was actually Libya. And there is, this shift of paradigm dealing with two different kinds of foreign policy. One, again, towards a non-state actor, and then the other one that developed towards Libya, towards obviously a state actor, which conditioned the Italian understanding of international terrorism as a wide phenomenon. But obviously, I could talk for 3 hours. You won't be happy, I guess. So I'm going to stop it, just saying one thing that was, part of the comment of our guest this afternoon. So dealing with memory, this is one of the most sensitive issues, because actually we have still, we are building up a memory dealing with the victims of red and black terrorism in the country, in Italy. We don't have any memory of international terrorism victims. They were probably less than the others, talking about numbers. But still, we must remember that the victim, for example, of the Rome synagogue terrorist attack in 1982, that was a kid of 2 years old, was recognized as a victim of terrorism just a few years ago, thanks to President Mattarella. So it's something that I think that our society still have to work on. Thank you so much to all of you for staying here. So, most important remarks. So first of all, I would like to say one thing, because tomorrow I'm not sharing, luckily. I will leave the floor to Professor Desberg and Professor Varsori. So I would like to thank so much the administration of the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies, especially Rosa Maria Campagna, Giovanna Perazzolo, Barbara Gollin, Giuseppina Paolo, and all, Anna Negrisolo, Francesca Alessandrin, so much. The IT service as well, that worked very, very hard for building up such a very huge event. I would like to thank the precious help of Dr. Octavia Moise, who is the coordinator of the organizing committee, and also our photographer and many other staff, Sofia Signor, Bianca Guerreiro, Marco Vianelli, and many others who really contributed to make these days unforgettable. So thank you so much. And we will meet now for the participants of the spring school, so also the students of the spring school, to have a drink at the Café Pedrocchi. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.